League since 2007. During that time, he has expanded the PADP project's work from 6 to 22 states. Good job. Prior to working for the League, Mr. O'Brien was the State Affairs Director for the Human Rights Campaign. He spent 5 years working in the Wisconsin State Legislature as a policy analyst and owned and operated a small business in Madison, Wisconsin. What's up?
There you go.
Yeah, you can take it out of the clip if you want.
I don't know if my glasses on or not because I'm writing my notes. Well, thank you all for being here this morning. I was beginning to think that the better predictor of bad weather this winter was whether or not this event was going to be held. And it was nice to wake up this morning and see no snow on the ground from there. So, I'm just going to start off reading a quick quote that Elizabeth McNamara, the president of LWD-US, made at the congressional hearing in October. She said, "This unprecedented attack on voting rights is one of the greatest self-inflicted threats to our democracy, our way of governing in our lifetime. These new laws threaten to silence the voices of those least heard and rarely listened to in this country: the poor, the elderly, racial and ethnic minorities, the young, and the differently abled. What we're seeing right now is an assault on voter rights we haven't seen in generations in the United States. We're seeing a broad sweep of anti-voter legislation being introduced and passed across the country. So I'm going to take a few minutes today just to share some basic information on what's going on, an overview of the different tactics that are being used by advocates of voter suppression, talk a little bit about why the League opposes the laws and legislation that's been introduced, how these laws are already having a negative impact on voters across the country even before they're being fully implemented, and how the League has been fighting back and being successful in the way. So really there's 4 basic tactics that we're seeing that are coming about in the states. The first is voter photo identification. The second is proof of citizenship. The third is shortening or eliminating the early voting periods in the states. And the fourth is targeting voter registration groups like the League of Women Voters, Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, etc. So we'll take those one by one. So photo identification. Before 2011 legislative sessions, there were only 2 states in the country that had strict photo identification laws in place: Georgia and Indiana. After the 2011 legislative session that ended at the end of last year, there were 8 additional states that had passed voter identification laws: Alabama, Kansas, Mississippi, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Wisconsin. There were 235 voter identification laws that were introduced in 38 states across the country. This is not something that just organically came about one state to the other. This is a concerted effort to suppress the vote across the country. I'll talk a little bit more about South Carolina. Put that in the list of those states that have passed, but there's possibly some good news going on there. One thing to keep in mind oftentimes is that when we mention this in public and we do polling, there is a great amount of support for voter identification laws across the country. Oftentimes people say, I've got an ID, I need to do that, to cash a check, to get on an airplane, to do many different things. You all right?
I'm fine.
Okay.
Get your glass fell over.
So, to do many different things with it. But what oftentimes people don't recognize is that it is a very specific type of identification that can be used in these states. Depending on the states, only some allow military IDs, some don't. Some allow student IDs, some don't. Some allow tribal IDs, and some don't. And so, for instance, in Texas and some enabling legislation in Mississippi, you can use a concealed carry permit in order to vote. You can't use a state-registered university ID, photo ID. So they're clearly targeting specific populations across the country trying to suppress the vote. One of the things that happened when Indiana passed their identification bills that it was challenged in the courts and went to the U.S. Supreme Court. one of the things that the court said needed to happen when legislation passed was that the IDs had to be free to individuals who needed them in order to vote in states. And so all the legislation that has been passed so far says that if you go to get your identification at the driver's license or a state ID specifically for voting, they're required to give that to you for free. But one of the things that we see that's happening across the country is that there's underlying documentation that is needed in order to get that identification. So although you might be able to go and to get your driver's license and they'll waive your $8 or $20 fee or whatever it is in that state, you may have to get your birth certificate, and that may be a $25 fee or a $35 fee if you were born in New York. And if you were going to get your birth certificate in New York, it could take up 6 to 8 weeks for you to actually have that turned around and given back to you. So, for instance, if you lost your wallet and 2 months before the election you didn't have an ID and you needed it, and you wouldn't have the time to actually be able to get your birth certificate, get back there, and be able to vote. The second tactic that's being used for voter suppression is through the citizenship requirements across the country. In 2011, there was one state that had that requirement, and that was Georgia. After the 2000 legislative sessions, Alabama, Kansas, and Texas all have implemented proof of citizenship requirements. And this is basically the same aspect as voter identification, but instead of having it at polls where you have to show that identification, you actually have to have it at the point of registration. That's it. So it's the same kind of implementation where people simply don't have the information for it. I'll talk a little bit more about how that impacts individuals a little bit later on. The third issue is targeting voter registration groups. And so like I said, in both Florida and Texas in 2011, there was legislation that was passed that made it much more restrictive and much higher penalties for third-party voter registration to occur. In Florida, for instance, it's a $5,000 fine, a third-degree felony, and up to 5 years in prison if you don't meet the requirements. There are 2 high school teachers in Florida who are registering students for the elections coming up. And they didn't recognize it was a 48-hour turnaround. So once someone signs the registration forms, they have 48 hours to actually get it back to the registrar's office. They didn't realize that they were a day or 2 late on it. They were probably doing their classes in over a week period of time. They were registering people and thought they could just bring it in afterwards. But the reality is that they missed the 48-hour time frame, and both have been charged under this law. It was interesting, they didn't know that they were actually charged until the press came to them and let them know that the charges had been filed. So they're fighting that right now, but it does have an impact on it, and the number of millions of people that have been registered by third-party voter registration groups in the past could be significantly decreased in the states. The fourth area that we saw is eliminating or shortening early voting periods across the country. 5 states have passed legislation this year or last year that does that. Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Tennessee, and West Virginia. And it's interesting to note that early voting oftentimes is something that mostly but a higher percentage of minorities and Latinos and African Americans vote during that period of time. And it's specifically on Sundays. And so what they've done in 2 of those states is target Sunday early voting as well. In Florida, it was the Sunday before the election. They were not allowed to, and I believe it was in Georgia, it's any Sunday. There would be no early voting that occurs there. So again, these laws are being implemented in a way that are specifically targeting needy populations, underserved populations, and those that are already underrepresented in the voting process. And of course, we expect more to come this year in the states. Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, Virginia is another state, and Pennsylvania could all see voter suppression laws passed before the 2012 elections. So the League opposes these new laws and legislation that have been introduced for really 3 specific reasons that we've been out talking about. The The first is that it disenfranchises millions of individuals, that it costs millions of dollars to implement, and that there's really no evidence that we need to have such draconian measures. Let's take those one by one. Disenfranchising millions of eligible voters. The Brennan Center for Justice did a study that came out at the end of last year that looked just at the 8 states that have implemented voter identification laws in the last legislative session. And they found that about 5 million individuals could be disenfranchised by those laws that were passed in those states alone in the 2012 elections. It's interesting to know, like I said earlier, that we often think that everyone has IDs, but about 21 million Americans do not have the necessary IDs that you would need if you're able to vote across the country. The second is the cost of implementation. One of the things that happened, and we really use this message when we're dealing with legislators in particular, because they tend to actually see the impact of what it would look like when they pass a law that would cost millions of dollars to implement. In Georgia, an estimate came out, I believe when voters was involved in putting all of that together, but at the high end, $22.5 million to implement the voter identification citizenship law that was introduced. There's 2 states that we can actually look at that have implemented voter identification across the country, and so that's Georgia and Indiana. So it's interesting to take a look. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about Indiana. Taking a step back, Iowa introduced legislation for voter identification, and their legislature said, we want to have a bipartisan group of individuals go to Indiana and interview the state and local election officials and see what the cost was and what the problems were in implementing their law. And so the county auditors from Iowa, I think there was like 8 or 10 of them, went to Indiana and did that interview. So what they found was that it was $12.2 million over a 4-year period to implement their law. That didn't include the lawsuit that went through all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court or training the poll workers as well, which had significant more cost to it. What they also found, which is interesting, oftentimes when legislators talk, it's like, well, you'll see a big bump in the cost the first year because everyone who doesn't have an ID that's needed will go off and get an ID and will have an additional cost, but that should even out in years to come. What they found in Indiana is that the costs actually stayed about the same every election year. And so there was no decrease in the cost. It continued to be a significant cost to the states. It's interesting that in the time that there's been such a budgetary crisis going on across the country, that in several of these states, the very first law that was introduced in Wisconsin and in Texas and in South Carolina was voter identification laws. Actually, in Texas, the governor called a special session of the legislature before they went into session a month later to actually deal with their voter identification law there and citizenship. The other aspect of it is there's really no evidence that there's a need for voter identification laws to be implemented across the country. Oftentimes you hear the other side talk about the fact that for the integrity of the voting process, we must be able to ensure that these people are the people that are there. There really has been little to no evidence that there is voter impersonation that happens at the polls. Existing law already has some pretty strict penalties if you were to try to impersonate someone else at the polls. It's 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. And if you're an illegal immigrant, you would be deported from the United States. And most people aren't willing to take that type of a risk to have one vote counted. It's interesting to note that after the 2000 elections, the Department of Justice, under the Bush administration, decided to do an in-depth investigation across the country on voter irregularities that were happening in the states or that had been identified by certain individuals or elected officials. And during that period of time, for 5 years, they did not find one instance of voter impersonation at the polls that was prosecuted. Not one. What we're seeing is that there's already an impact, a negative impact that's happening across the country in these states that have passed the laws and are beginning to implement them. I'm going to give you a few examples here. In Tennessee, Dorothy Cooper, she was a 96-year-old retired domestic worker. So if you think about it, she was born before women had the right to vote in this country. She had missed only voting in one election in her lifetime. but she was denied her identification card because she lacked the proper identification. She had her rent receipt, copy of her lease, her voter registration card, and her birth certificate when she went to get her ID for voting purposes. But because her birth certificate had her maiden name on it, she was not allowed to get her voter identification. And this is an issue that comes into play, especially with women across the country who have been married. And so then it's not just the cost of having to go and get your birth certificate, it's also the cost of having to go and get your marriage license to be able to show that the connection between how your name has changed throughout that period of time. And of course, there's cost and time involved with both of those. Virginia Lassiter, also in Tennessee, had been voting for the past 70 years, but she was physically disabled. And she went to get her driver's license or identification for voting purposes, and there was 150 people in line. She asked for help to see if she could get to the front of the line, and they denied that. They asked if there was someplace that she could sit or rest while she waited, and the people there would not allow that to happen as well. And so she simply was not physically able to sit and wait in line for an hour and a half in order to get her identification, and she left without being able to get it. One other issue, and this was a 19-year-old man in Kansas that the league has been working with there and trying to get his identification. And this was one of the issues that the Indiana, the Iowa bipartisan group found when they did interviews in Indiana, was that there's a catch-22 with this as well. That here's a 19-year-old man who had never driven, so he wanted to get his license, and he went to get his license, and they said, well, do you have your birth certificate? And he said, no, I don't. So he goes, okay, so the league brought him to the vital records and asked for his birth certificate. And he said, well, do you have a picture ID? And he said, well, no, I don't. I'm getting this so that I get my picture ID. And they said, well, sorry, we can't give you your birth certificate unless you have an ID. And you can't get your ID unless you have a birth certificate. And this is an issue that's playing out across the country. Individuals simply are caught in this catch-22, and they literally are unable to get the identification because of the way the laws have been. In Wisconsin, there was an honorably discharged U.S. Marine who's been unable to get his identification as well. And I'm going to try and read this here. His name was Ricky Lewis, and he's actually part of a lawsuit that the NAACP has gotten into against trying to fight back the law in Wisconsin. He said, I showed them all kinds of ID. I showed them photo IDs, one from the Veterans Administration and one from Milwaukee County. I also showed them my discharge papers from the Marines, but they said that it wasn't enough because I didn't have a birth certificate. So he wrote to the Vital Records Department in Madison, Wisconsin, sent them a $20 check, and they sent him back his birth certificate. But his birth certificate had the wrong name on it. So they said to him, he went there with his birth certificate, and they said, well, the only way that we can give you an ID is if you go to court and have them certify that you are indeed the person who you are. So here's an individual who was in the Marines, was willing to risk his life for our freedoms, and was put in a position, he's got a picture from the Veterans Administration that's there, he's got his discharge papers, and they still won't allow him to vote. So, as you can guess, the league across the country is pretty upset with these laws that are going on. And I'm happy to say that actually in 13 states last year that we were actively opposing this legislation, we were successful in fighting it back. In Colorado, Delaware, Iowa, Maine, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, North Carolina, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Ohio, Oregon, and South Carolina. We were able to fight back legislation. And I'll talk just a little bit about some of the things that they did. There were letters to the editors, over 48 written or oral testimony given in state legislatures across the country. 131 letters to the editors were sent and published. 22 op-eds were published across the country. 13 press conferences held in the states. There were over 150 newspaper articles educating the public and mentioning the league and the work that they're doing in opposing this. And there were numerous action letters that were sent to legislators across the country. They worked in large coalitions, and they also received quite a bit of funding from the National League over the the past 5 years, about $325,000 has been passed through to the states to help fight back some of this legislation and to deal with other issues regarding border protection. So that was what we did in trying to stop the legislation from being passed. But what we do once the legislation actually has been passed. One thing is that in 5 of the states that passed voter identification laws last year, they are covered under the Department, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And this section requires all or part of 16 states, of which Virginia is one of those states, although I think it's 14 counties and 4 municipalities are not covered under this requirement. But they're required to declare any proposed legislation that deals with elections procedures either by the U.S. Department of Justice, or they have the option of going to the district court, U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. So the 5 states that are covered under that are South Carolina, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. In South Carolina, on December 23rd, for the first time in 30 years, the Department of Justice actually denied pre-clearance of election laws, and they denied pre-clearance of the voter identification bill in South Carolina. What's happened since is that the state has come forward and they are appealing that decision to the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. In Texas, they went to the Department of Justice, and then they decided, they waited until the very last one day before they were supposed to give in their deadline to give information to the Department of Justice. They gave some information, but not actually the information that the Department of Justice asked for. And then the next week they said, it's taken the Department of Justice way too long, so we're going to the District Court in Washington, D.C., and we're going to ask them to decide for us. And so right now we've got 2 of these cases at District Court in Washington, D.C. In both Florida and in South Carolina and in Texas, the League of Women Voters is planning to intervene in those cases and be a part of the lawsuit urging the Department of Justice and the courts to deny pre-clearance. One of the things that we see and that we've thought about, we've been aware of as part of the tactics, is that we really anticipated that this plethora of new laws that were being implemented in the pre-clearance states were actually a way to try and overturn Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Many of these states feel that they are being treated unequally because other states would be allowed to pass this legislation and have it occur, but they wouldn't be because they're under the pre-clearance piece of it. And so we anticipate that regardless how the district court, both in Texas and in South Carolina, anticipate that it will go to the U.S. Supreme Court. That actually is the next step. It goes from District Court in D.C. directly to the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's a possibility that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act could be overturned this year before the 2012 elections. Let me just mention one thing, and it's something that just fascinates me about the way that South Carolina responded to the Department of Justice request. So they said, we need to implement this voter identification law because of voter fraud. So the Department of Justice said, please give us instances of voter fraud. And I said, well, we can't actually find any instances of voter fraud in South Carolina. We've never seen it. It's never actually happened. We have no proof that it would. But, it could at some point in the future happen. And so that was one piece. But then they said, well, tell us the number of people that you have that are registered voters in the state that don't have the required identification. Those people that would be disenfranchised by this law, potentially disenfranchised by this law. And they said, well, that's about 239,000 people. So basically they were saying, we need to pass this law because, we need to protect the integrity of the elections. But we really have no proof that there's any problem with the way of the elections, and no one's pretending that there's somebody else. What we're going to tell you is that we have the potential of disenfranchising 239,000 people. And then they get upset. The Department of Justice said, well, that just doesn't really work for us, and we're going to deny it. And it's interesting to note that of those 239,000, it was disproportionately affecting minority voters. And actually, Section 5 only looks at minority voters and minority language groups within that. So they can't look at whether or not it's affecting other people in general. It's just those 2 groups of individuals that the Democrats that can be looked at. We've also done lawsuits in 2 other states. Florida is fighting their voter registration law in the district court as well. And in Wisconsin, so I said Wisconsin from there. So they filed a suit to overturn their voter identification law based on their state constitution. The Constitution says there's basically 2 groups of individuals that can be disenfranchised, and one of those are by age, you're not old enough to vote, and the other is if you have been convicted of a felony and haven't been released, given your voting rights back. What they're saying is that this new law actually creates a 3rd category of individuals that would be denied the right to vote, and it's those individuals that do not have voter identification cards or cannot obtain them. But the reality is, in some of these states, the law is being implemented, and we have to do our best to make sure that the impact that this has is as low as can be. And so, throughout the states that have had this occur, there's a great deal of education that's been going on, town hall meetings, a lot of press events, working with the state elections commissions, government accountability boards, etc., across the country. And also trying to assist those, identify those individuals that are having a difficult time getting their identification, assist them in getting their identification and working them through that process. In Wisconsin, the Dane County League received $5,000 to actually identify individuals who couldn't afford to get the underlying documentation or having a difficult time getting the ID in order to vote. And so they're actually able to help pay for the underlying documentation and work them through that process. And there was an individual, a gentleman who had moved from out of state and into Madison, and he was robbed of his wallet, which had Social Security card and his ID and all that in there. And so he was stuck again in this catch-22, not being able to get an ID because his first certificate, et cetera. And so it plays out in many states across the country. The other thing that we're doing across the country in some of these states is really doing some poll observations. In order to go to federal court right now, the strategy tends to be when Indiana's lawsuit occurred and went to the U.S. Supreme Court, they just said that on the face of the law it was discriminatory and it should be struck down. So on its face it was bad. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, we don't really buy that, but if you can prove to us that this is having a negative effect on voters across the country, that it actually is disenfranchising individuals, so as it's applied, and as applied rule, then we might take another look at its laws. And so what this puts us in a position is we want to try and find individuals that are being disenfranchised when they go to vote. So we have to go through 1 or 2 election cycles to identify individuals who are being turned away in order to set up a lawsuit that can go to the U.S. Supreme Court to show that indeed people are being harmed by this. And so in Wisconsin and in Tennessee, there are observer programs that are being set up by the leagues there, going out to the polls in targeted communities across the state, trying to identify people and that are being turned away and get them into lawsuits that will be able to challenge this in the federal courts. There are lawsuits that are going on across the country in many of these states, ACLU, NAACP, MOLDEP, etc. are working on that. So the fight is continuing. The league has been, I believe, instrumental in ensuring that these laws have been stopped, or legislation has been stopped before they became law. And even after they become law, the fight continues in a way that I'm extremely proud to be part of across the country. The tenacity of the league is an amazing thing, and it's a great power that I believe that if we were not there, if we were not present in these states, that many of these laws would have been implemented without a challenge. I'll just stop with a final quote from Elizabeth in front of the congressional hearing last October, where she says, "Now is the time to act. We must work together to repeal these unjust and prejudicial laws, implement new laws that lower the barriers to voting and ensure that every eligible citizen will have the ability to vote and have their votes counted." It's a very simple democratic ideal, and it's under attack, and we will continue to fight. Thank you.
Very much. What we're going to do, we have Tim. We're going to ask Carol Newell to come up and give us a rundown of what's going on in Richmond. Then Cameron Quinn, our registrar, will come and speak. After that, we will have a question and answer period. We will be sitting up here, but I will give you Jim's instructions right now. Everyone is supposed to use the microphone, and we have to repeat the question before we answer it. Okay? So Carol is with the State League as a legislative coordinator. She's also president of the Prince William MAL. So please welcome her.
Well, thank you very much, but I want to thank all of you because I know that what's been happening in Richmond and the effect of what we've seen this week has a lot to do with league members from Fairfax and Prince William and getting the word to lots of people on these issues. And it's been very enlightening today because it's a new experience. So as a novice, I've depended on some great resources who've been following this for years, such as Therese. I need some good words to say to the committee to take Therese help. So what, I don't know how many of you know the good news, but we've had no photo ID bill passed. And that includes proof of citizenship is not passed as well. So just how it happened is not always clear. But I think there are two parts of it. Number one is money. And number two is just a lot of pushback, and thankfully other states have been acting on that already, so there's material to show just what happens if they try to pass it. So early on there was confusion because some of the bills were regarding coming to the poll without identification at all. And then currently in Virginia, if that's the case, you can sign a form that you affirm your identity and vote with the regular ballot. The early bills that were discussed meant that if you came without identification, you were required to vote provisionally. So in fact, that bill has passed. I'll explain what some of the IDs are, but it is not, that was not a photo ID bill at all. And they kept stressing that. Because there were wonderful people who came early to make statements on that, and they just, unfortunately, were focusing on the photo ID. But what we had also in Richmond were wonderful partners that we could work with on site. We had people from the NAACP, we had the ACLU, there was a group that got together to help work together, including someone from the Martin Luther King Center for Public Policy. And they had great resources as well. So we collaborated, and people came to the committee hearings. The subcommittee hearings were not in big rooms, so they were packed, which was good. And wonderful local people came to just emphasize how they really wanted their rights protected. And the committee chairs were pretty good at that, accepting that testimony. Just regarding, I'm just going to mention to you quickly the bills that did pass was the Senate Bill 1 that was to require identification in order to vote a regular ballot. And it got altered as time went by because it was not a photo ID. In fact, it increased the number of documents or items that you can use for identification. Interestingly, originally it said you cannot use your voter registration card as ID. They took that out, and so that still exists. You can still use that, and numerous other pieces that were already there. They did add your handgun permit. So you can use that for identification. And actually, quite surprisingly, because there's one senator on the committee who represents some significant rural areas, he said, well, what about if somebody comes in and the election officials know that person, they recognize that person? I said, oh, okay, we'll do that. So that's actually there. The election officials recognize you, you're okay. So we do anticipate then, of course, that there'll be more provisional ballots if people happen to come without their identification. So there actually wasn't much of a fiscal impact statement with that one, but if in fact there have to be more provisional ballots printed, there's actually some cost to that. The House bill, similar House bill, is not exactly the same because, I forgot one other ID you can use on that bill is if you have a student ID from a 4-year higher education institution, you're actually put that in it, but it's not in the House bill. So the House bill did take out the voter registration card. So when the House bill goes to the Senate and the Senate bill goes to the House, they're going to have to reconcile that to determine that. When the other part of that Senate bill, the first time it went to the Senate floor for debate, one of the readings it passed something like 22 to 18, that means 40. The final vote was 2020. And so therefore the Lieutenant Governor wrote the tie. It passed. Of course, he voted for it. So the provisional ballots will be, or the regular ballots won't be allowed if you don't have ID. Then regarding the one, just quickly, that did not pass, that was the onerous bill that we were concerned about with the photo ID and proof of citizenship, was very slow in going through the process. When it came to the full House Privilege and Elections Committee, it came with an enormous amendment that could not even be read in the 5 minutes that it appeared before the committee meeting started. So it had mistakes in it. The dates were different from what had been in the first bill, when it would be in effect, and it was obviously hurriedly done. And it did not come with a financial or a fiscal impact statement. And that did not come until Wednesday this week, when the meeting had started. So the delegates hadn't even seen it. In the meantime, 3 or 4 different organizations put together our own fiscal impact statement, and they varied it in total from someplace like $2 million to $9 million. With all the costs and implementing and getting free IDs. The delegate who patroned the bill said one of his first statements was, well, we know that of our voters, 92% of them already have a driver's license, so they have all that they need. Well, that means that the 8% who don't have it is 400,000. So if you take 400,000 times $10, maybe a photo ID right there, that's $4 million. So I think if you say the 92% had it, that's not great. But if you think those that didn't, it's huge. So I think that there was a lot of activity on looking at the cost. And then, of course, we had the people who would be disenfranchised and all the costs that Tim has already mentioned. And it just kind of, that bill didn't get a lot of movement, and it finally went to the subcommittee on appropriations. And at the end of the meeting, they just said, oh, we won't take any action on it. So it just was then assigned to the full appropriations committee that was going to meet at 3:30 yesterday. And by the end of the day, they, oh well, we're not going to do it. So we're just kind of dying there. And I don't want to say very much except a couple of other things related to voting. I think another reason I think that money was a factor is that the registrars they wanted to increase in full-time registrars. I think 14, and the fiscal impact was, I think it was 17. 17.
For 140,000.
Exactly, for 140,000, and they wouldn't do that. So if they couldn't cover 140,000 for registrars, how are you going to do 9 million for photo ID? So I think that was part of it. The other thing that was disappointing is that there was no, there were 5 bills at least, to increase the number of people who could vote absentee. By age, none of those happened. The other part that did not happen, there was a bill that was pretty successful to require registration by party. And although one of the options to register was as an independent. The bill in the Senate went to the floor, but it did not pass. And one of the hearings on that bill in the House was that this is just like a five-member subcommittee heard this, and the chairman said to the patron, "Why do you want this?" And so he decided a case where there was going to be election for a sheriff, and they only expected 1% of the voters to come out and vote for that. So if they had to register by party, that candidate really wouldn't have to contact very many voters if they were registered by party. And so the chairman said, "You mean we're saving money for the voters or for the candidates?" So I think it was for the candidates. So they rejected that. Plus, there was concern about one of the bills said that if we registered by party, and if there was going to be a closed primary, then the voter turnout is much lower. So that was another factor, the voter turnout. So that did not go forward. In fact, I must tell you that the chairman of the committee, I did make a brief statement to that one, even though I sort of knew he was not in favor of it. And so when he made his statement before they took the vote, he said, and I think this is historical, "I don't usually agree with the League of Women Voters." But in this case I do. So I thought that was historical. And I told you later, I said, "You never know, it might happen again." So one other issue was poll watcher police. I think the one issue was about the central absentee voting situation. And apparently there are poll watchers there when the provisional ballots come in, and they look to see whether or not they can actually open it or look at it, and if they're rejected, that's put in a stack. So there was somebody who was concerned that there are poll watchers there who notice somebody's rejected, so they'll make a phone call to that person to go vote at the poll. And so the concern was that there are some poll watchers there watching for who they want to get to the poll, and some others are not making the calls. But as I recall that when those police weren't passed. And the other part, of course, that's been happening is redistricting. And there was a Senate bill passed to have a bipartisan commission ultimately in 2010 or 2020. It passed in the Senate, full Senate, but I think it's just going to languish and never get to the House. So it's not, at least this year. And that was not a constitutional amendment. And one of the reasons that they want a constitutional amendment that they don't want to have the next set of legislators to go against it. We have the constitutional amendment that can make it happen. So I think that there's a lot of drama and a lot of issues, but I think there was a lot of persistence that made them decide that they just didn't need to make these restrictions on our voters. So far, so good this year.
Thank you, Carol, so much. If I am correct, I think she really is a new leader. She has not been in the league that long. So she not only jumped in, she dove in. And we do appreciate all the hard work. Now, the next speaker is a lady we're very, very happy to have. She's our general registrar for Fairfax County, excuse me. She is a national and international expert on election law, administration, and reform. From 1999 to 2003, she served as Virginia Secretary of the State Board of Elections that was awarded the 2002 Grace Hooper Government Technology Leadership Award for early adoption of online voter services. Many were first in the nation. She then served as U.S. Election Advisor for the International Foundation for Election Systems, working with states and territories on compliance with the Help America Vote Act. She has worked with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, has been Director of Domestic Program at the U.S. Peace Corps, most recently the Department of Defense. She was Senior Policy Advisor for the Federal Voting Assistance Program. In 2011, she served on the Virginia Independent Bipartisan Redistricting Commission. Yay! She also served as an academic advisor for the 2005 Commission on Federal Election Reform. She is an adjunct professor teaching election law at George Mason University School of Law, where she previously served as assistant dean. Ms. Quinn earned her BSBA at the University of Florida and her law degree and master's in accounting from the University of Virginia. Karen, we're very honored.
Let's see if I can do this without having to hold this thing down. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we are.
All right.
If you talk louder, it'll work better.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll see what I can do. I want to say thank you first to the League for the opportunity to come speak. The League is such a wonderful partner for election officials across the country, and I know in Northern Virginia, since I've been here for a long time, how active the leagues are in Northern Virginia and how much the Fairfax League, along with the other Northern Virginia leagues, not only makes an impact on election administration locally, but it has a profound impact on the state coming down for legislative session. And I assume, Carol, you've taken Phyllis Bailey's place?
No.
No, is Phyllis still around?
I'm not taking anybody's.
Yes.
No, I shadowed in Sterling.
Okay. Is Phyllis gone?
Yes, she
Oh,
was speaking.
Phyllis was such an institution in Richmond when I was there, and truly, the League, I don't know that you all appreciate how much she was really respected across the board, not just in the elections arena, but a number of other places where she would show up and talk about other bills that the League is concerned about. And those kinds of things make a huge difference. I was talking to someone who was a new legislative aide earlier this year, and is just beginning to sort of really appreciate pace, the challenges of trying to catch legislators, even as an aide. And she said, now I appreciate better why we have lobbyists and how good lobbyists can make such a difference. And Phyllis certainly, in the years I was in Richmond, was one of those who made a huge difference. And I have no doubt that Carol is doing the same kind of things.
Thank goodness somebody set the reputation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I also want to say thank you all for the work you all do here in Fairfax and that Facts for Voters. It's a fabulous, fabulous piece of literature And I apologize that we're not really in a position right now to be able to hand it out. I can tell you that the staff was incredibly upset when we realized that with the new Spanish language requirements, the fact that the fax for voters doesn't come in Spanish, that basically we had long conversations with both the county attorneys and the AG's office attorneys and the state board. And there was just this sense that we run into exposure on whether or not we're complying with the language requirements if we are providing that kind of information only in English. I know the league was looking at whether or not they might be able to provide this in Spanish as well. I encourage you all to do so, because we would very much like to continue to be able to pass that out. But at least at the moment, given the new Spanish language requirements here in Fairfax County, it was not a decision we reached with any kind of happiness. In fact, I think very profound disappointment is the only way to say it. We still, frankly, rely heavily on that, and you see a number of copies around the office. And I'm happy if people have questions to talk about what the Spanish language requirements mean, although that's not really the point of speech here today. I am also want to say I'm so pleased to be the new registrar of Fairfax County. I have been involved in elections in Virginia now for 15 years, and even when I was at the state board, relied very heavily on the Fairfax County Registrar's Office because they have such fabulous people working there. And while I knew a number of them before I got there, now that I've been there for 3 to 4 months, I've got to know all of them, and we are truly blessed as Fairfax County residents with the caliber and the dedication of the staff that we have there. I'm really pleased to say that one of my staff, Mary Lee Crabb, is Assistant General Registrar, is here today. And she's my short timer of my senior leadership team. She's only been with the office for 10 years. And she actually served as an assistant. Remember the old assistant registrars who would go out and do volunteer work and try and help register voters? She's done that since 1974. So we are very blessed in Fairfax County with some extraordinary talent. And I truly, I couldn't do my job without people who are already there. And the skills that they've developed and the leadership that they have. I mean, they have been through 5 general registrars in 10 years, and it's still an extraordinary operation despite all the changes in leadership at the top, and that certainly speaks to the rest of the staff. The nice thing from my perspective is that particularly after Carol's presentation, I have very little left to say. You know, Tim did a wonderful job of setting the stage at the national level. Carol talked about where things are now in Virginia. I have been asked to sort of talk about what the costs were likely to be at the local level of any of the voter ID bills. Well, we started with about 7 or 8 bills, and there are now 2 left. And I can say to you all that generally speaking, the cost of the 2 that are left is pretty negligible. Because in neither case is there going to be a massive change in process or procedure. It's not the kind of thing that will affect voters that requires massive voter education. It's not the kind of thing that's going to require massive changes in training of our election officials, which, by the way, we already changed dramatically in the last couple of years how we're training them. So there is some additional cost, but that went back to the state requirement that we be training all offices of election at least once every 4 years, along with the new requirements for more hands-on training related to things like the equipment. So to sort of slip in this or any other, and there are lots of other changes related to process, is really not, it's what they call in law a de minimis effect. There really is no way to calculate it, but it's so negligible it's not worth talking about. And both the bills that are still pending really do try to make things easier. Both the Senate Bill 1, the Martin Bill, in addition to several additional forms of IDs Carol talked about, also allows this vouching. Someone was saying, well, that's sort of an interesting concept. It's actually been in effect in New Hampshire now for decades. New Hampshire being a small rural community as well, by and large, where people all know one another. And so the concept here is that if an election official knows this person and can vouch for them, then that should be sufficient. it will be a little harder in a place like Fairfax County where a lot of people that show up at polls don't necessarily know their neighbors, for that vouching to be able to truly take effect as it's intended. And there may be some questions if this bill passes as to how that's implemented. Counting on the state board to tell us, since it's not just Fairfax that's going to have that issue, but pretty much any jurisdiction of about 50,000, 75,000 people. The Senate version, that's the Senate version, the House version that Mark Cole has, additionally would require a signature comparison if there's a question about whether or not somebody who didn't have the required forms of ID had in fact, was who they say they were. Both provisional balloting increases and signature comparison would add some cost in terms of staff time between election night and the point at which the boards do their votes on provisional voting. But as a practical matter, it's not going to make a huge impact. So the good news is there won't be a whole lot of cost if either of these identification bills move forward. You do see wild swings in national costs. A lot of times the legislature's biases in what should be the cost of voter ID sort of show up in these comparisons. You see everything. The electionline.org did a nice summary recently, in fact, about a year ago, of different costs, and went from Colorado, where they said that it would be absorbed within the annual appropriations, to Kansas at $68,500, to Iowa with $173,000 in fiscal year 12 and $345,000 each year thereafter, to $2 million in Texas, and about $5 million in Wisconsin. And in Missouri, I think, came up with about $10 million. So very often the impacts, there's something to do with local, how it affects things locally. If people already have certain kinds of ID, and they often know how many people are lacking those kinds of ID and doing data comparisons. And in other cases, sort of what's being allowed as ID, when you talk about Tennessee, which was allowing an affidavit of identity that found zero impact, and that was probably appropriate. Probably was at least a few $1,000s of impact. But when you have an affidavit of identity and you don't have to get in the photo ID, it's not going to cost nearly as much as some of the photo ID bills. So there's dramatic impacts across the country in terms of cost, but a lot of that varies based on what the bills exactly say. It had HB 569, the Danny Marshall bill that was pending with proof of citizenship and the photo ID passed. Millions. It was, the state board, I think, was estimating somewhere in the 2 to 3 million range. I think the league was using estimates more like 5 million. It's a little hard to say exactly because, frankly, a lot of the provisions of it weren't very clear yet. They had a requirement for posters, and the new additional poster in polling booths. Now, the cost of an individual poster by the time you post it, not that much, but at the same time, the frustration when I saw that requirement is almost everything in that poster is already in one of the other posters being posted. So if you have to do another poster, it's an additional cost, but if you can actually get the bill sponsor to stop and pay attention long enough to understand what's already in place, there may not be a need for that poster. So one of the challenges, I think, for all of us, and I know Carol probably feels the same way, when you've got these bills pending, and these guys usually, they have other lives, they don't usually focus till they get down to session, they haven't really read what somebody drafted when they gave them the idea, they don't really completely appreciate what the process already is in place, although there are 140 election experts, I'll have you know. Trying to get them to understand that maybe there's a better way of doing the same thing they want to do can be a little frustrating unless you can get their attention. And so over the years, what you find if you're doing this is you develop people with whom you have a relationship, to whom you can go and say, here's something that needs to be fixed. And the nice thing is that generally speaking, if you're sort of targeting the right people, they're able to get those fixes in so that it takes away a lot of the problems. usually are unintended consequences of the whole process. So, I would say this. Typically, at a local level, when you're talking about these kinds of bills, there's 2 or 3 kinds of costs you can anticipate. One of which is very hard to explain or quantify, but is in fact an impact, and that is the cost of change. And I'm going to explain this to you and talk a little bit about the language requirements, because I think it helps illustrate the point. You know, the language requirements, basically Fairfax County now, under the Voting Rights Act's language requirements, must provide all voter information and voter outreach materials in Spanish as well as English. It's not, you know, unfortunately for an election administrator who like to do it right, it's not like the Department of Justice puts a list up and says, here's all the things you have to do, and if you do them, you're okay. It doesn't work that way. But having worked there and having worked on a lot of these cases, I had a pretty good idea of what kinds of things we ought to be doing. We've been doing the budget, third quarter budget review process, and we had to see if we could explain the increased cost in hopes of getting a little bit more appropriations from the county for the second half of the year. And as we went through it, we realized that the actual out-of-pocket county costs was something under $25,000 or $30,000 for the November election. There'll be some additional costs for the rest of the year that we have to also account for. But a lot of it was the initial translation of documents and a little bit of advertisement and those kinds of printing costs. Printing costs, of course, will always be there. But we did a number of things that we won't have to do again, at least for a few months, and can get through the next couple of elections with those things we've already printed. But what was a cost that really can't be qualified was the cost of learning the change and making the change in the people process. And I can say to you that for the month between the time we were designated and election day, it was pretty much exactly a month, there were 2 employees who pretty much worked full-time, doing nothing else but trying to figure out how to make that change. And another 3 employees who worked probably half-time trying to assist in that process. And it probably was taking about 25% of my time, which is a brand new registrar. I could have been spending doing other things that I was trying to understand, like learning the right people around the county to figure out how to get help. The nice thing, again, in Fairfax County is our county attorney is someone, the assistant county attorney who works with elections is someone that I've known for over a decade as well. And as soon as this thing came into place, he says, don't worry, I'll reach out to the right people. And we had a meeting about a day and a half later with about 30 people from across the county talking about, you know, what needed to be done and what resources there might be to help get it done. But the county is truly, you know, sort of willing to make sure that things are done right. And it was an extraordinary collection of people who immediately understood and wanted to make sure that we, the county, did things right. And gave me a lot of assurance that as I have other things come along that I can't necessarily anticipate but that we have to react to, that the county is going to make sure that we can do what we need to do to make sure that the citizens of Fairfax County aren't impacted negatively any more than can possibly be avoided by any kind of change that comes down the pipe. And really, again, gives me comfort that I showed up and joined an organization that's going to try to make sure elections are done right. So, the whole issue of photo ID, however you want to call the issue, really is an interesting microcosm of a huge fight going on in society as to the direction of this country. It is not unreasonable to say that we are, in some ways, a unique democracy. There are a number of things we do differently than most of the rest of the world. That make it right doesn't make it wrong, but I think we can take great pride that we have a democracy where people truly feel empowered to vigorously advocate very different points of view without any consequences. I've done a lot of work over the years overseas with democracies, emerging democracies, And it really reinforces to me sometimes how lucky I am to be an American. Because there are people taking the lives in their hands when they advocate a point of view different than the current government. And while many of these places require things like identification, when I was working in the Republic of Georgia, I heard stories about the fact that the government actually had created 250,000 or 500,000 fake IDs that were being distributed to make sure that in areas where the government needed to make sure they had enough votes, there were people to show up and vote with these different IDs. So, you know, the ID itself, if you aren't convinced the process has integrity, isn't going to make a difference. But I thought it was sort of interesting. There was a quote in the electionline.org story, which, for those of you that might be interested, I would certainly recommend. It was the March 17, 2001 election line that talks about the cost of voter ID. But a Kansas election official basically said he didn't estimate many additional costs in his jurisdiction, but he doesn't think the larger debate over cost or fraud is going to change many people's minds on whether or not requiring photo ID that polls is worthwhile. He says, I think this issue either speaks to you or it doesn't. I know voters will have more confidence in voting if we require voter ID, because I've received several emails and phone calls over the years, at least 20 to 1 in favor of ID. But if 5 or 10 or 100 past cases of potential voter fraud don't make someone think voter ID is necessary, 1,000 or 10,000 probably won't either. Every election issue that I've watched fought over the last 15 years since I started the state board elections typically comes down to the whole question of access versus integrity. And this, again, this is an extraordinary debate because in most countries, they don't bother to get to this level of conversation about society and what shape society should be. As a general rule, most changes in elections are going to be either more access is provided or more integrity is provided. When people talk about election reforms and you look at them, almost always that's what it's about, at least when there's a fight. But just because something necessarily creates more access doesn't mean it reduces integrity, or if it creates more integrity, it doesn't necessarily reduce access. There are ways, generally speaking, of trying to achieve both of those, and to me, the key is to try and figure out how to maximize access and integrity in everything we do. So, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Look forward to answering questions, and look forward to work with you all for the next few years. Thanks.
I would just like to note, for you all to notice, that you have your facts for voters for this year on your table. So they were ready and done July 20th. January 20th. See, I won't be president July 20th. Maggie, would you like to stand up and let us applaud? Yes, in our league, you're always I am just going to speak briefly about Spanish. We are in the process of trying to figure out if we can get an insert put into our facts for voters, at least for the Office of Elections. If anyone knows somebody that is a Spanish interpreter that would work for free, please let us know. But it is something we know we need to do. We recognize that this year was just, we didn't have enough time to do it, but we are going to be starting it. Okay. Before we start the question and answer, I would like, so I don't forget, without get started.
Thank
Okay, who would like to be the first questioner? Surely we have Jane.
Now, how do I get to a microphone? Because didn't you say you wanted it?
Well, just talk loud until we repeat the question.
Oh, you'll repeat the question. Okay, here's the question. In 2004, I lunched the day after the general election with a group of friends I knew from years ago in the PTA. And one of them, whose political persuasion was not the same as mine, said she had a friend who had voted in 3 states, who was bragging about having voted in 3 states. She did not approve of that, even though this was a friend who agreed with her politically. She didn't approve of that any more than I did. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I did ask the person at the Fredericksburg League Convention a few years ago. I asked a state official, and she said, well, they're working on that issue, but they don't realize, I'm not worried about voter impersonation. I'm worried about a group of people who might commit fraud because they own property in more than one state, and you can imagine what group that's more likely to be. I mean, that's my opinion anyway. So that's, which is a whole different issue from voter ID. So that's the question I wanted to ask, because this person, I want to say it's a state registrar, but I don't know if there is a state registrar. But she said they were working on that issue, but it wasn't something that, because Virginia was farther ahead in even establishing a state database than some of the other states were. So I'm wondering if there's been progress on that issue, because that's actually worried me a whole lot more than whether you're having any voter impersonation, and it's worried me ever since I heard that.
Okay,
Can you quickly summarize?
Can one person vote more in more states in one election, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I know they can't legally, and that's, I believe, a federal crime.
Okay, has there been a problem, and how can we correct it?
Yeah.
Has there been a problem?
Is there a problem? That's my first question.
So, the answer to the question is it a problem? Yes. How much of a problem? We don't know. But I will say, in addition to your friend's story to you, when I was at the State Board of Elections, we got a call at one point from the state police trying to find out about a couple who were registered to vote in Northampton County, sat on the Eastern Shore, Cape Charles area, if you all know that part of the state. And we checked, and there was such a couple registered, and they had applied to vote absentee. They had not yet voted absentee. And the story came out that this was a couple who lived in New York, had a summer place, or excuse me, a winter place in Florida, and had apparently already voted in both Florida and New York, and had in fact applied to vote absentee in Virginia as well. So there are these situations out there. The thing that sort of stunned me about that one was these were elected officials in New York. One would have thought that perhaps they, more than most, would have thought that was inappropriate. Somehow that's not the case. There are these kinds of situations that occur, but it's sort of hard to say how frequently they occur. On the other hand, the fact that someone told you this, I worked when I was very young on a campaign in Kentucky. I was still in college, in fact. And I can remember election day, coming back to headquarters, and someone at the headquarters saying, well, I just finished voting for the second time. And I was young, I thought, that seems like something I ought to somehow tell somebody about, because this doesn't seem right. But I was a little bit too young. I was in Kentucky for 2 months. I didn't really know people, and I couldn't quite figure out what to do, but it's bothered me ever since. There are places where this kind of thing is, I mean, and she talked about the fact, this was sort of family tradition, you always voted at least twice. I have friends out of Illinois. You get the same kind of thing out of Illinois, I have to tell you. So it is not that it doesn't occur, but it doesn't occur very often. Most people, I think, if they do it, don't talk about it. And so it's very hard. It's not something I think people can admit to frequently, particularly in a court of law, so that you can actually prove what kind of thing that occurs. Now, in terms of the solution and the data matching, here's what I can tell you. Virginia has been ahead of the curve for a long time on the whole issue of a statewide database. Until the Health Care Vote Act was passed in 2002, there were only seven or eight states that had a statewide database in place. And except for Michigan, which had recently done so, the rest of those databases were decades old. Virginia and Louisiana, South Carolina, several others had put these statewide databases in effect back basically in the 70s. When I was in Virginia, we had this COBOL system, and for those of you who know computers, COBOL, even by the time I got to state board elections in the late 90s, was such a dead language. There were 3 people we were aware in the state of the program, and 2 of them worked for us. So it was an old system, but it worked very well. Because of the fact there were so few states that had statewide systems, the idea of database matching was not realistic, even though it was something people were talking about even at that point. We tried, Virginia a couple of times had done data matching with DC and Maryland prior to my arrival, in fact, while I was there. But it was still challenging to make it work properly. And we had done the data match at some point, I think, before I got there, where we had some hits where we had voters that were both on the DC rolls and the Virginia rolls. But during the time I was there trying to work with DC, there was some problems with their IT staff, and although we did a data match, they found 0 duplications, and everybody agreed that that was clearly wrong. So the technology, I mean, it's been 15 years now since that was occurring. Technology continues to evolve. It's becoming easier to do what they call comment limited file matches. And the Election Directors Association, NASED, and the Secretaries of State Association, the National NAS, have been working on trying to come up with a common data scheme that all states would use to then be able to do matching. And in addition, there's a project being undertaken by Pew that's looking at ways to try and do more of this matching. So there are efforts underway. I would have told you 5 years ago, I would have thought by now there'd be a little more of it going on than there is. But there's still some matching being done by individual states. Kentucky, which is one of the Social Security states like Virginia, gets the full 9, did data matching with Tennessee and South Carolina and actually came up with a number of what looked like potential same voters based on Social Security number kind of matching. So there's efforts underway. We're moving in that direction. We're not really quite there yet.
The answer to the question is there a problem?
Yeah, I think this kind of brings up another issue, and that is I had a friend who heard that somebody else might have done something over there, and then that suddenly becomes the reality of the situation. And so, taking a closer look, I think, at what that actually means. So, for instance, an example is in South Carolina, after they were denied their the pre-clearance when voter identification law, their district attorney came out and said, we have evidence that there's 960 some dead people who have voted in elections. Like, wow, that's a lot of people. For what period of time has that occurred? And they went to all the seasons and that, well, he gave us the names so we can check it out and see whether it's true or not. And he said, well, here's 6 names that we've got. So they checked out the 6 names, and 5 of those names were simply clerical errors that occurred, and there was nothing illegal with it. And the 6th name was an individual. He wasn't indeed dead, but he had voted absentee before he died, sent in his absentee ballot, and it was counted. And so there's instances where you hear, and we've seen this across the country, where a year or 2 before legislation is being introduced, the voter suppression legislation is being introduced, small groups will start to occur that are brought in, that are paid for, that will start saying, voter fraud exists, voter fraud exists, voter fraud exists. And they get the mindset of the public into really questioning the integrity of the voting process in their state. And so then the legislature can come in and say, we're going to fix that problem. And so it really is a tactic that's being implemented across the country, and that's in a way that is well thought out with it, and that most of the time when you take a deep look at what they're saying occurred, it actually hasn't occurred. There's a great report the Brennan Center did called The Truth About Voter Fraud. It's about, I think it was 2006 or 2007, but they actually go through and all of these examples of things where people are saying this happened or that happened in these various states. And they go through, they investigate it and find out that it is virtually non-existent.
Okay, Deb?
Thanks. You had mentioned Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. I understand that there are some constitutional challenges right now towards that. Could you let us know what's going on with that?
Okay, did you hear Section 5, constitutional challenges to that? I think I read an article in the paper.
Right, yes.
I think the one that's moving through the courts right now is Shelby County in Georgia. You may know more about this aspect of it, but it's a challenge where they're basically saying that, so the original Voting Rights Act, when it was implemented, as there's 16 states that either in full or in part have to have all of their voting laws and pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or by the District Court in Washington, D.C. And so over the past several years, there has been a renewed effort to try and challenge specifically Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, saying that it is unconstitutional. And so those two instances are occurring, and we're also anticipating that with the South Carolina challenge that is now District Court on the voter identification law, and Texas challenge, which is also District Court in D.C., that either one or both of those will likely go before the Supreme Court and be challenged there. And we're unsure how that will turn out. Some additional.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name. No, Helen, there's a lady that likes to approach.
Here.
Okay, if I understand correctly, she's saying transportation is a big issue in getting to vote, especially if you have to use metro, buses, etc. I don't really know.
I'm not quite sure how to respond. I know that to date, there's not been anything that says that localities are required to provide transportation for voting. I know when we were looking at making changes related to voter registration, and I don't know if you all remember this, but the Department of Motor Vehicles had offered across the state that if registrars wanted to co-locate in their offices, that was something that they were willing to basically take on all the costs of putting a registration location inside of the DMV. And for some of our registrars, frankly, the office space and the equipment and everything they would be providing was so much nicer that there were a number of registrars looking at this option. And there was a fight, in fact, in Lynchburg, because the Lynchburg registrar's office wanted to move and co-locate. And at the time, they were located downtown right on the main track, and the DMV was not exactly on the main track. And there was some local fight over whether or not the office ought to move, and the whole issue of transportation came into the picture. But at this point, at least, as a practical matter, courts have not gotten into this issue. Most places where there are problems with transportation, political parties offer that. And in most cases where there's a good metro system or a good bus system, there are attempts to try and accommodate voters on election day by those regional bus systems and or, in our case, metro. But it's certainly not something that I'm aware of any elections office having to take on the challenge of doing that or even for that matter, that generally speaking, the local elected leaders of a locality take it on, other than to try and work with the bus systems and the other public transit systems. I do know that generally speaking, the paratransit systems will provide rides when necessary if the mother is actually legally blind. She usually uses them for other things. She knows that she can use them when she needs to go vote. If she doesn't have a friend who can take her with them. So
I think it's for voter registration, right? Because not the voting, but how do you get your registration card? Where do you go to get it? And that is.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood the question.
I think
in terms of voter registration, because of motor voter, there's really no requirement that someone goes somewhere to vote anymore. To register anymore. Because they can download the forms on the internet. That, of course, is not useful for everybody who doesn't have access to the internet, no question about it. But anyone who is disabled who gets services should be getting voter registration services through their service providers at the same level as the services they're getting for disability. So if they're getting someone coming to their home to help them with things that's being paid for by a state, what should I say, Medicare, Medicaid provider or disability services provider, they're supposed to have the opportunity to register to vote through that process as well. And if that's not occurring, then let us know and we can start trying to talk to the state to work with the state agencies to making sure that's occurring.
Plus, if anybody calls our office and say, we can't download the form, or, I can't get out, we'll mail you a registration form to your home. And for voting, we've got the annual form, where you can complete the annual form. If you are confined to your house, you're never going to be able to go to your polling place again, then we have an annual form where when you initially submit it, you will have to have your doctor sign it saying that you have a disability. And for every election that you're entitled to vote in, we automatically send you a ballot for every election, but every year it's like renewing a subscription to a magazine. We'll send you a letter and say, Jenny, do you want to do this again? For the election year for 2013, if you say yes, we keep sending you ballots. So, low income.
And if I could, there's two things came to mind during the conversation. One is the public assistance agencies are actually required by law to register individuals when they come into their to get services in the same way that you go when you get your driving license. They are required to do so. And if they're not doing so, the authority should be told about that. In several states, the league has gone in, including here in Virginia, and looked at public assistance agencies, whether or not they're complying with that. With reports, and it has increased quite a bit here in Virginia over the past few years. In Arizona, we actually had someone kind of change costumes and go in and try in different various areas to do so. And the Department of Justice has been called in several states to ensure that that's being implemented in a more fair fashion and even fashion. The other thing that's occurred in some of the states, the league has worked with local election officials to actually set up early voting precincts in assisted living facilities. So where those individuals have a difficult time getting to the polls, they actually go in and will have 1 or 2 days where they will allow individuals to vote. They bring in a voting machine and the access is applied to that as well.
I read, actually, I believe in a letter from Elizabeth McNamara that some conservative activists plan to fan out on the next presidential election day and challenge certain voters at the poll. And I was wondering if you could speak to maybe how state laws vary in who is allowed to challenge a voter in a certain state.
Did everyone hear that?
No.
Okay. Helen said she read that in the next election there's going to be some people that are going to challenge people at the polls, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And she wanted to know if, I guess what anyone knows about it, is there anything
Who is
set up?
allowed to do
Who
this?
is allowed to do it?
can talk more broadly about that. I believe it's a group called, I can't remember, something like True the Vote or something like that, but that's not actually it. And they're based in Texas, and what they're doing is they're trying to recruit about 1 million individuals across the country to go into polls, observe, and challenge individuals based on various ways in which they can be challenged. We see this as kind of another voter suppression effort that's popping up across the country. The laws vary significantly from state to state, and who can actually be observing, what they can do, who can challenge who within it. And so that's a very different piece of information that's out there, but they're really looking into that. There's a voter, the federal elections coalition that is working on this is very much aware of it, and we're kind of doing a counterattack on it as well. And so we're going to try and get individuals into the precincts where we think that those challenges will most likely occur. There's new iPhone pieces that you can use, and actually there's a problem occurring, you just kind of push that button, and then the people in DC will know about it, be able to send lawyers there or talk to people directly on kind of what the challenges are that's going on. And so there's really this fight that we're anticipating in a way that hasn't occurred in the past, and is significantly bringing more challenges to individuals at the polls than has been happening. It's more coordinated effort.
Can you define challenge? I'm not sure I understand. If you can. I have a hand up.
Yeah.
This is the last question. I'm sorry. After Hammond speaks, we're going to have lunch. Sorry.
If I speak quickly, maybe she can get a question. There is, in most states, and there is in Virginia, a process by which voters on election day can challenge a voter. And what typically occurs if that's the case is the voter then is asked to sign an additional statement that effectively says I'm qualified to vote in Virginia. As the current law stands, if they sign that statement, then they are able to vote regular ballot. The two voter ID bills that are still pending, at least one of them, I think both of them, would say that that person would then vote a provisional ballot. The provisional ballot would then note under the Senate version that the voter did or didn't present identification of what kind. And the version in the House has this opportunity for signature comparison. And it's not yet clear exactly whether or when or what circumstances a challenge voters would count. In the 15 years I've been doing elections in Virginia, the number of voters I've heard of being challenged and taking place on election day are almost zero. So while the provision is in place, it's not something that's typically used.
I shouldn't ask this, I don't want to take the time. This lady brought up a very good point, which bothers me, and this is frustrating. I'm asking you a question which I believe you can't do much about, but I'm just mad about it. In our country, both locally and nationally, we have a very strong group, and we won't name names or journalists, but it can be by TV or radio or anything. But there is a very vicious thing going on, misinformation, and it affects this voter ID thing. And if you say something over and over and over again to people, and people that don't have access to something like the League of Women Voters, so they don't hear anything other than from their radio, or the TV, or the newspaper. And unfortunately, and I don't know what we can do about it, but it seems to me that the side that's being more honest and being accountable for what is true, not enough of that word is getting out. And I don't know what we can do, even at the local level, where I hear things and I have to get up and debate with people, but it's in their mind because they hear it over and over again. From your point of view, and I honor you for what you do, but if you could kind of hit the public education or whatever, we could get the word out to people that aren't getting it.
Okay, we just said that there's a lot of wrong information getting out, and how can we counteract that? Now, that's something that we're going to have to work on ourselves. And we plan to. There's something, power to vote, is going to be put into place soon. That's just my point.
It's definitely been a huge challenge over the past several years. And I think that in some ways the tide is changing a little bit just because of the amount of focus that has been on voter suppression laws across the country that have been going on in this last legislative session and now. And so the messaging is starting to come out much stronger, I think, than it was in the past, where it tended to be more one-sided and more about voter fraud existing, etc. We were having a hard time getting our message out. I think in those states where this has been a very hot issue, for instance in Missouri, they have had their bill introduced for the last 6 years in a row, and it's been defeated every time. But I think people there tend to be a little bit more educated on what the facts are on both sides. And I think the league has been instrumental in ensuring that the message is getting out there, whether it's through town hall meetings that the state and local leagues are having across the states, having questions in the debates that are occurring that they're hosting. We've had two members, a member from the executive director from Wisconsin and the president of the league from Florida, who've been on national television, on MSNBC, and having sections on there, being able to talk and give our point of view on what's going on. And again, there's quite a bit of Elizabeth at the congressional testimony that went on. Some of those committees are actually going out into the country and having committee hearings in different states that are being affected by this, and is being active in that role as well. But it is a challenge. It's a challenge of understanding how to best talk about this to help change people's mind. What we do find is that once you engage in the conversation and explain in greater detail, people tend to move away from the, well, of course they should, to, oh, I get that it's a problem and maybe we shouldn't go down that path. But it's having that time frame in order to do it. So it's a challenge and it's going to continue. But I think the more that we're out there and repeating the same message over and over again across the country, and it's one of the things that the Voter Protection Project has been able to do is connect leagues across the country to be able to reiterate the same message over and over and over again, and I hope that it gets into the general public.
Because like I said, that's